Good morning to the beautiful Big Blackfoot River. Today is July 6th, 2021, and we are fortunate enough to be here with the Library of Congress Teaching Primary Sources representative, Michelle Pearson, and our incredible author, John Maclean, who has just finished a chronicle of his family, the Maclean family, and some say the backstory to A River Runs Through It. We'll spend some time today exploring the places and the memories along the Blackfoot River from bygone days, actually from as far back as 1806, and we'll explore Lewis and Clark's Trail. We'll explore many other trails, including the fishing trail of the Maclean family. And I'd like at this point to introduce Michelle Pearson, who is our trainer with TPS from Metropolitan University in Denver.
Welcome from TPS and the Teaching with Primary Sources program with the Library of Congress. We're thrilled to have John with us today, but most importantly, we're also really pleased to be able to bring place-based learning and literature together. This story tells a story of rivers and home, but most importantly, it tells a story of place. And we hope to bring all of us into a sense of place through John's eloquent words and his description of what the river means to him and his family. We're tickled to be here today. We're going to be asking John some wonderful questions that we hope will lead into really rich and deep discussions within the classrooms, both with students and with teachers, so that we can reinvigorate our understanding of literature and how it relates to place. Thanks for being with us.
John, think about the long history of this site. What do you think Lewis would have been doing here?
Well, the Lewis party, himself and 9 men and his dog Seaman, got here at the end of the first day up the Blackfoot River. They had separated from Clark at Traveler's Rest and crossed the Clark Fork River with considerable difficulty and been washed down a mile or so. They'd gotten into a camp near Grant Creek and been assailed by hordes of mosquitoes. So they made it 8 miles up the Blackfoot the first day and got here and discovered there were no mosquitoes here, which filled them with joy. But they were on a trail that had been used for millennia by Native American tribes. And they called it the Road to the Buffalo, and they called the Blackfoot River Kokalarhishkit or Kokalahishkit, and I'm probably mispronouncing it, or the River of the Road to the Buffalo. And there was a major trail, an ancient trail that went by right here that led from the western tribes so they could get out onto the eastern plains where they could hunt the buffalo. They used it usually twice a year, on summer and winter. They had to come back in the winter to replenish their supplies. And it was a well-worn trail. Lewis's Nez Perce guides, who had gotten them over the mountains to Traveler's Rest, accompanied him on the first day to the Grant Creek campsite. But then they said, "You're on your own from here. It's Blackfoot Indian country. We are not going to go in there, but you will have no trouble finding the road. It's very plain." So they had come through about 8 miles of narrow canyon. And if you drive through that from Bonner to here, you wonder how in the world they managed to navigate on the north side of the river. Because there's huge rock scree piles that come down there. And it's probable that at places they had to go up into the mountains, get over a hump, and then come back down to the river. But the mileage that Lewis gave for that first day on the Blackfoot was 8 miles. And this is 8 miles upriver, so that they were not making extended 5-mile journeys to the side. They were pretty much right along the river. They arrive here and suddenly there's flats, there's a bench, it opens up. There's trees and there's good grazing for the horses, and they come to camp. What they would have seen at that time on the south side of the river is almost exactly what we're seeing right now. This hasn't changed. You'll see that it's sturdy rock there, that's granite. That doesn't shift with the seasons or with the years the way, say, the Bitterroot River does. The Bitterroot River is in a flat plain and it One year it's one place and the next year it's somewhere else. This is always the same place. So what we're looking at today is what Lewis and his party saw. Did they camp exactly here? I don't think it was exactly here. When they got out of the narrow part of the canyon onto the bench, I think they probably went exploring a little bit, move along a little farther, maybe a half mile, 3/4 of a mile, and they would have been looking for fresh water. At this time in July, when they were here, almost exactly to this day, the Blackfoot River was way high and turgid, and you would rather drink from a freshwater spring. So it was somewhere along this bench. The trees that are around here are exactly the kind of trees that they would have seen. They're big ponderosa, there's Doug fir, there's some spruce in here, and if you were to look across the river at the south side, there is one gigantic tamarack over there that I would bet is more than 220 years old, which means that it is a witness tree. That tree was here when Lewis and his party came by. So what did it mean that they were moving up the river? They were the first white men, they believed, to be in this part of the country. The reason they named the Clark Fork River the Clark Fork is that they thought Clark was the first person to navigate it. The first white man, not person, but white man. They came in here and suddenly everything was going to change. The river didn't change, but the road to the Buffalo was starting to eclipse, and it wouldn't be used the way it had been before, and with 100 years it would be a derelict artifact. There are signs of it still in places where you can see what it was, how well worn it was into the ground, but it was the beginning of the end of the road to the Buffalo and the beginning of the coming of the white man.
So when we think about the river today, what should students think about? What should the community think about when we talk about why does this matter? So what? What's important?
Well, history doesn't stop. It keeps developing. And when you look at what there is today and think, well, so what that this used to be used by the Native Americans and that Lewis came by here. If you don't know about these kinds of things, you're living a very shallow life. You're living a one-dimensional life. If you want to live a three-dimensional life and bring things to the present moment that affect the future, that attempt to restore the Blackfoot, to keep it relatively pristine, to limit the use of the Blackfoot so that it doesn't get hammered and ruined, and retain its sense of serenity that it brought to the Native Americans who used it for thousands of years, to Lewis who traveled along its shores, to my family, to people who have lived here for the last 100 years. That quality is something that is worth preserving and enhancing in the future. It's a job to be done. And if you know the history, you understand the place, it's part of you, it's important to you, there are things that you can do to make this the kind of place that your children and grandchildren can have the kind of experience that you've had.
John, if we were to try to connect the basic outline of Home Waters, how would that book particularly help connect the reader to this river? In what ways does your book connect to the river?
Well, the Home Waters covers a period of over 200 years. And one thing I did in that book was try to answer questions I've always had. Where did the Blackfoot get its name? How did it come to be called the Blackfoot? Obviously, it's named for the Blackfoot Indian tribe, but when did that happen? How did this all start? When did the fish come in here? When did the rainbow trout come in here? When did the brown trout come in here? This is a native cutthroat river. There were cutthroat, grayling, whitefish, and bull trout in here when Lewis came by. They didn't fish for them because the water was too high and they were moving quickly. But where did the rainbow come from? Where did the browns come from?
I'm trying to say specifically how Home Waters and the stories that you weave in Home Waters relate to the preservation of places like this and how they play a role, what kind of a role they play in that endeavor.
Well, what I try to do in Home Waters is point out how valuable a resource this is, and also point out that it is being lost. There is overuse of the river, it's being hammered. We're here on a day that's going to get very, very hot. In the old days, it never got this hot in July, it didn't. And it was this hot in June, it was into the hundreds in June. That doesn't happen, we're in a period of climate change. So what does it mean to be losing all this? Well, in order to realize that, you have to know what was here. You have to know the sense of commitment to a place, of growth from a place. I mean, you grow out of a place. That's what you're part of it. You're not a tree, but you know, you're a person that is attached to the land. And if you see it being lost, and I think you see that in Home Waters, that there was something really wondrous here, and that it is threatened.
Do you feel that there are efforts that you would recognize that say, we'd like to get back to a better place? Maybe not the original place, but we're endeavoring to get back to a place, and how we could see maybe students becoming involved in some of those efforts?
Well, say history moves forward, and we're not going to get back to 1806. We're not going to get back to 1910. We're not going to get back to 2000. But there are simple, straightforward things that especially young people can start doing to keep the heritage here. All the way from participating in the cleanup day on the Blackfoot, where you go out and take all the trash that the irresponsible rafters have tossed in, the beer cans and all the plastic, and get it out of the river. And they do that every year. Okay, maybe you're not up for that, or you're out of town on that day. But when things come up that represent conservation efforts, politically and in other ways, it is possible as an individual to support these, all the way from a letter to the editor to just being right-minded about it, and to doing right practices when you're here. Your own individual actions make a big difference. So if you just behave properly, you're doing something.
So I have a question. When we talk, we're in one particular place on the river, and you mentioned the witness tree, and you mentioned the river and what the granite looked like and the flats. What else should we be thinking about in how the historical place connects to today? What are the landmarks? What are the things that people should look for, knowing that that's historical rather than something today? What are the things that stand out, John?
Well, you have to be careful about the historical things, because you have a cultural history here, and if we go around giving GPS coordinates for each of the places that are still existent, you're going to have people trampling all over them. But I think that one thing you can do is to read. This sounds odd, because a book is not a landmark. But if you read the literature that connects to the Blackfoot, then you get a sense of the whole thing, and go places where you can see it all. One of the wonders of the Blackfoot Valley still, from here all the way to Rogers Pass, is that it is one of the least molested valleys left in Montana. And if you can get at places where you get a little elevation and you can look out, you can get what we used to call the 100-year-old feeling, where you can look out and see things the way the Native Americans might have seen them, the way Lewis and his party might have seen them, and it has not changed radically. That's an enormous landmark. There are very specific ones, all the way from highway markers that tell you a little bit about the history to, as I said, places where you can still see signs of the road to the buffalo. So there are all kinds of ways to approach it historically, but to have an historical outlook, to be looking for things like that, is what will get you there.
John, if you can imagine for just a moment, I don't know if this is a place where you fished with your dad, or you fished with George and you were going to fish today. How would you approach this place?
Well, this is a very interesting hole. And it's, you can see it's a rapid up here, and then it goes against the bank over there, and that's in shadow right now. And while we've been here, I've been watching to see if I could see a riser. and I haven't seen any, but there's an awful lot of insects in the air right now. The caddis and mayflies. And the mayflies move very sweetly like that through the air, and the caddis go like this on a real bumpy ride and kind of tap the water to dip their eggs in. And I expected to see, especially in the shallow area, small fish moving, and that hasn't happened. So if I were to fish this today, I would fish with an emerger. To get under the water a little bit, because there's nothing really working on the surface. And I'd start up toward the top, fish the rapid close in, a fishing distance out, and work on down, and try to work that bank a little bit where there's shadow. The fish don't want to go out in the sun and look up and, oh my God, I get blinded by that. They want to be someplace where they feel safe, where they can spot what's coming their way, and where they can not be nailed by the sunshine. So you could fish that whole bank all the way down here. I think this would probably be a better evening hole, because there's nice soft water in here. Toward evening, when it's in real shadows, the fish can move out in the middle of the river and sit there in their feeding lane and wait for the fly to come, and they come up and kiss it and go back down. What will happen especially with a big fish, is he'll go up that channel, maybe 30 feet, looking for something to eat, and he'll get it, and then he'll just let the current drift him back down. And so you watch for that kind of activity. A lot of fishing is watching and being careful in what your sight is. But from here, down here for a quarter of a mile is, to me, really nice evening water. And you would watch for a riser and cast to the rising fish.
Is this a place that you ever fished with your dad?
No. We didn't come down this far. We didn't fish the lower part of the river. My dad and his family fished this part of the river near Missoula when he was growing up. But once we had the cabin at Seeley Lake, partly for travel reasons, but also partly because there were fewer fishermen, we would fish far above this on the middle Blackfoot, where it comes out of the Blackfoot Canyon below Lincoln, and then it gets fast, and through its length there, it is rammed up against the Garnet Mountains. And the hole that you fished 5 years ago, you come back and there it is. It's still there. That hole that you figured out 5 years ago is just the same. So we fished from there down to about to Clearwater Bridge.
When you speak of fishing at that side, have you seen a distinct change in the movement of people towards Seeley and the activity on the river, your direction, where it used to be more quiet? You mentioned that it was quieter when you were there. What's changed in time?
Well, the river is not today the same experience that we had. The movie Of a River Runs Through It and the book, and I just saw Fish Rise. The movie Of a River Runs Through It especially has changed the whole use of the river. First of all, it helped restore the river. It brought money in, and the money was put to use on tributary restoration and on other good projects like that, and it brought the river back. But it also brought an enormous amount of attention. In the last 2 years with the pandemic, that has become, it just exploded. The guides all say, well, we've never saw a year like last year, and this year is bigger. You can go to a popular put-in spot on the upper Blackfoot where we used to fish, and one day recently there were 100 rigs at that put-in spot. That is gross overuse. This river can't stand that kind of use. The Madison couldn't stand it. It's a bigger river. The Yellowstone couldn't stand it. It's a bigger river. Just people have to come here. They're driven to come here by the book. And the state of Montana has been very lackadaisical about addressing the issue of restricting use. It's restricted on some other rivers. There are rivers where you can't have commercial boats operating on them certain days of the week. There are all kinds of other restrictions. The Blackfoot doesn't have that. And as I said, there have been times when I've gone down to go fishing and looked at the use of it and just turned around and walked away.
So we've read a lot in your books about your family, but now we have a mom question. How would your mom view the relationship of your family to the river?
Well, that's an interesting question about women. You have to go back to a very different time culturally, and you're going to get me in a lot of trouble here. Because the relationship of the women to the river was usually to set up a picnic and to keep everybody happy and in line and a sense of community. Women did not fish in those days. That has changed. The only woman in our whole family, I think, who fished was Dottie Burns, my Uncle Ken's wife, and she only fished in the early part of the season when nobody else was around. And she'd take a can of worms and go down to the little prickly pear behind their ranch in Wolf Creek and heave out a big fat gob of worms, catch a fish and put the rod on her shoulder and run like hell up the bank and drag the fish out of the water. The women did not accompany us on most of the fishing trips, but we would have big family picnics that the women ran, and ran very well, because you had to deal with 15, close to 20 people sometimes, numerous cars to get out there, a campfire, a setup, and all the rest of that. I think that my mother understood how important the river was and fishing was to us, at least to the degree that she more than tolerated it. She was part of the family that was attached to the river. She didn't come down and swim in it. She didn't fish in it. It was not, being in the river or on the river was not her thing. But being part of a family that was connected to the river certainly was.
If your mom was to say to someone, he was inspired by this to write the book, what do you think her perception would have been?
Well, I think if my mother read my book and somebody asked her, why did John write this book? She'd say, oh, he's always been crazy about Seeley Lake in Montana. He tried to find a way out there when he was young and went in a very different direction. But we always knew that he was the one who loved it as much as anybody, and maybe more than most.
Okay, so now I got to ask another question. So as a fisherman, I grew up fishing, but as we talked about, I was a bait fisherman with my dad. So when I went back to go through his rods after he passed away, there were certain stories that those rods told to me and those reels told to me. Tell me about your first rod and reel.
Oh, my first rod and reel was just a horror story. It was a metal thing with bends in it and so on, and there was a lot of argument about, well, shouldn't we, get something better than this and actually buy something new? And buying something new was not the ticket to getting ahead in the family. There were a bunch of Presbyterians, and my father was an English teacher, and my grandfather was a Presbyterian minister. We were not big money people. So I used this rod, and I used it once on the Blackfoot, and it had a reel that went with it that wouldn't turn. And I remember vividly being, as far out as I could get when I was a little kid, which wasn't very far, with this rod that couldn't cast, and I couldn't get out to a rock where I knew there was a fish, and the reel wouldn't reel in, and I started almost crying. That was my first bad rod. My first good rod was one my dad bought me for Christmas one time, and it was a joyful thing. It's a Wright McGill fiberglass rod, one of the first fiberglass rods. I still got it, and I used it for years. And if you were to look at it today, you would think, my God, this is an imitation of a telephone pole. It's not flexible and nimble. It's not a very good rod. For the day, for the time, it was a very good rod. One of the things that happened to me was after I quit my job at the Chicago Tribune after 30 years and started writing books and coming out here a lot, is I had to learn fishing all over again and get into a whole new set of gear and techniques and flies and all the rest of it. So there are really two stages in my life of fishing gear. And now I find that I'm still a little bit behind on some things, and I need to catch up. But I've got enough going that I can operate.
So now what's your favorite one? What's your favorite rod? What's your favorite reel?
Well, I don't have a favorite rod or reel. I have a collection of rods. I've been the family pack rat. People give me things and I collect things and put them away. And what I wound up with was discovering my grandfather's H.L. Leonard. H.L. Leonard bamboo rod is one of the finest rods ever made. H.L. Leonard is known as the grandfather or the godfather of the American bamboo rod. And my dad always told me about this rod. I said my dad had this Leonard and it was yellow, which is characteristic only of the Leonard. Most bamboo rods are brown because they've been heat treated to make them strong. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So later in life, again, when I started spending a lot of time out here, I found 3 pieces of a yellow rod at the cabin in a collection of cabin rods. And I took them to a guy who knows about this stuff and had them authenticated. He said, well, the 2 bottom pieces are a Leonard, but the tip is not. He said, if you had all 3 pieces of the Leonard, you really have something. And I thought, well, you know, I really do have something. I've got my grandfather's rod. The tips always used to bend and break on those bamboo rods. You'd go over to Montgomery Ward's and buy a new one for $1. So I had that rod. After my father died, I inherited the fishing equipment. And one of the rods that I got was his bamboo rod, a Granger Champion. And there's a whole, later on I was going through his files and discovered the story that I knew, but now is documented, that he had won this rod on a radio contest by submitting a question that was used on the air. And we were out here in Montana, and he got this letter saying, be sure to listen to the so-and-so Rod and Reel show on such and such a date, because your question and your name are going to be on there. And the date had passed. And we didn't have radio reception anyway. And he'd missed his big chance. So he wrote to the guys on the return address and said, can you send me a copy of the transcript? And we're out, you know, in Seeley Lake. About a week later, he got the transcript. So I had the transcript and I read through it, and sure enough, his name was there and it was spelled. And they sent him this huge box of stuff, a lot of which was just junk, great big treble hook things like that were totally inappropriate for what we do. But there was this Granger Champion rod in there. And my dad fished that for a long time under special circumstances. And if he was feeling especially generous on the river, he would hand it to me and let me fish his Granger rod for a little while. Then, when I started fishing a lot in the east and had all these collections, I thought, you know, I wouldn't mind getting my own bamboo rod. Normally I fish graphite and the compound rods and all that, but a bamboo rod is special. And we have these little streams in Virginia, in the Blue Ridge, where you fish for brook trout. So I needed a short rod. So I found a guy to make me a bamboo rod. And I actually traded him a rod, a Granger Champion that I'd acquired for this rod of my own. And I modeled it after my grandfather's rod. And it's a thing of beauty. It's yellow. We had emerald wrappings on it. The handle was a piece of green burr that when we finally machined it and looked at it, it had 3 or 4 animal faces in it by chance, a big wolf and something else and a coyote. And I fished it for a while, but I kept having to take it in to have it fixed because it was weak. It hadn't been heat treated. So I finally turned all 3 rods over to the Montana Historical Society for custodianship.
You know, John, in Home Waters, you tell a lot of the backstory of fly fishing. And I think for me, one of the most poignant things is your description of the people in town who came up to fish up here and the friends that you brought along with you, the Cronenbergs and all of those people who made the fly fishing world. I believe Dave Roberts, some of those people. I'm wondering if you would share with us a little bit about the fly tying world and how it's remained the same or changed over the years, the history of it, and how we could teach kids about the art of not just fly fishing, but of fly tying and why maybe it matters.
Fly tying is a very demanding craft. You can do it badly or you can do it extremely well. Missoula, Montana was a major center of fly fishing and fly tying in the early part of the 20th century. And the dean of those guys was a fellow named Jack Beamy, who owned a part share in the Turf Bar down, I believe, on Main Street. And he had a little corner of the saloon where he did his tide flying operation. And he gathered around him imitators and others, and they together created a whole stream of different flies that were very important. Beamy was also a very fine fisherman and caster, and held records in distant casting that were about as far as you could cast in those days. So one of his flies was a balsa wood fly, a great big thing like that. And I was looking at photographs of it and said, that seems fairly reminiscent of a bunyan bug, and also reminiscent of a cork grasshopper that George Kunenberg's tied. And in fact, Paul Bunyan, who did all the bunyan bugs, knew about these guys, frequented the place, and I think took that initial balsa fly design and evolved it and improved it and made it much more complex. There's a pattern on a bunyan bug that isn't on the balsa fly. The balsa fly is pretty raw, but Bunyan found a way to do a very delicate pattern, salmon fly-like pattern, on a bigger cork body, and then he tapered the body, which the balsa isn't tapered. So he evolved from that, and you had this happening all over the place. George Kunenberg's flies, he told me once, were based on a Beamy tie. And what he did, what George did, was to add to the bulk of it by putting a lot of yarn on the fly and then putting the quill over it. So you have a meatier, fatter fly. Then you get into, who had the highest quality. And if you look at the Jack Beamy flies, he was a beautiful fly tire. If you look at George Kunenberg's early and George Kunenberg's late, you see how good he was when he was early. He was still tying flies when he was in his 80s, but they weren't of the quality that they were when he was in 40s and 50s and 60s. And he taught one guy, a friend of his and now a friend of mine, how to do it. There's some tricks to this, little secret things. And if you look at the imitation ones that were tied and then look at George's, you see the difference in craftsmanship. And I think even my friend would acknowledge that. So there was a whole school of guys like this. Fly tying is a season extender. You can do this in the winter. You can have a community, as Beamy and those guys did, where you pass things back and forth and evolve. It doesn't all have to be done on the river.
And we know that there's more backstory with people like Dave Roberts, who, of course, wrote a weekly column in the Cincinnati paper. And he became friends with your family very early in his life and fished around the Bitterroot and the Clark Fork River with your family. But then he continued to pay tribute to your dad throughout your dad's life while he was still a professor, and your grandfather, yes. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and tell us a little about that.
Well, Davy Roberts was the son of a prominent Presbyterian family in Missoula. They were parishioners of my grandfather, and Davy and my father were contemporaries. Davy went on to become a very significant figure in outdoor writing. He helped create and was the first president of the Outdoor Writers of America Association, which is a big deal. I knew him. He moved to the East Coast near me toward the end of his life, and I spent a lot of time with him talking to him. But he wrote a number of columns about my grandfather, and I reproduce one of them in Home Waters, but there are others. And the families were very close, but not the way we were close with the Kunenbergs. The Kunenbergs were the real people that we mixed with. I think that the Roberts Sr. and the Reverend Maclean were very close friends, and some of that paid off on the next generation. I took my dad out to see him one time, and we spent an afternoon with Davy. Right when A River Runs Through It was about to be published, I think, and they talked about that. And Dad was a little, he said, Davy could have done more with writing. And if you look at his writing, it's very period writing. but he did an enormous amount of it. He was very influential. He had a very good life, and I spent a lot of time with him and really liked the guy.
Did you and your dad and George, your grandfather, who fished here?
Well, if you went along 40 miles of the Blackfoot River around here, that would be a place where we fished together. This happens to be one of them. And we used to have this pretty much to ourselves, which was wonderful. It's not that far a drive. It's about 25 miles from the cabin. There's plenty of water. There's so much water that when we bring 5 or 6 people down here, everybody could kind of go off on their own and do their thing. I tell a story in Home Waters about my father encountering a black bear at the end of a fishing day, and that happened here. We're at the bend in the river here, but both upriver and downriver there are very, very high banks. And it was on one of those where that anecdote happened.
So when you were fishing, I'm going to go back to this. What were your favorite flies to use? I know there's so many different factors into that, but where did you lean?
Well, our favorite flies when we fished together, all of us, the Kuennebergs and the Macleans and so on, were George's flies because they worked, they were sturdy, and they were free. So that was one whole period. They're wet flies. Some of them you can fish on the surface like the cork grasshopper, or you can dope them up and fish them on the surface. But they're big, sturdy, I call them working men's flies. And we'd always start with the yellow quill. You come down, what are you going to start with? I'll start with the yellow quill. You might get into something else. If the caddis were really out heavily, you switch to a brown quill or whatever. When I came out and had my second learning event with fishing, I branched out a lot. I still have a lot of George's flies. I still fish with them. That yellow quill is dynamite. When nothing else works, that'll dredge up a fish. But I got into dry flies. George didn't tie dry flies. That wasn't his thing. I like them because there's a lot of action. You can see the take. It's a little more precise. It's fun. But the stock, the common stock, was George Kuenneberg's quills. And among those flies, the yellow quill was the queen.
John, as we stand here and take a look at this whole thing, what do you think the biggest threat to not just this site, but to the Blackfoot entity and our western Montana? What is the biggest threat?
The biggest threat to the whole of western Montana and to the idea of Montana is overuse, overpopulation. Montana is big, high, wide, and handsome, and there's room for everybody, and you can do whatever you want, and nobody can tell anybody else what to do, and that just doesn't work anymore. People who were real Montanans out here never had a lot of money. The rich guys were absentee landowners and inholders. Ross Toole used to talk about who owns Montana, and it turns out that most of the people who own Montana didn't live here. Now you have an enormous amount of money pouring into the place. You have more people. The real estate prices are going crazy. And if you were to pan away from the beautiful river behind me to the parking lot, you'd see what I'm talking about. It's overrun. And imposing regulations and restrictions almost can get you shot in Montana. They've tried it here on the Blackfoot, and the guide community and other people, and it's just gotten worse. It hasn't gotten better. Paul Roos, who was one of the great guides, one of the great conservationist guides, was part of this, and he tried to do things, and even he couldn't convince people to hold back. There's an enormous amount of money at stake. You know, figure what it costs to hire a guide for a day and put 200 boats on, multiply it by 200 boats a day. And you're talking about a kind of income that Montana didn't even dream about unless you were a mine owner or a big cattle rancher from the old days. The last 2 years have seen increases in use of the outdoors that are in many ways commendable. And we're going back and finding out that the outdoors is really important, especially in a time of pandemic. It's something you can do. You found out that your family is important when you're being denied your family. when people are dying without being able to hold the hand of a loved one. Suddenly it becomes, whoops, maybe an iPhone isn't the greatest thing in the world. Maybe human touch is better. So that's part of what's happened here. The guides have told me that last year they'd never seen anything like it, and this year is better for them. This year, the climate is a catastrophe out here. You get into 100 degrees in June. I mean, we never had anything like that. And if you don't believe in climate change, I don't know where you're sticking your head. But you have both bad weather conditions and a huge increase in use of a resource. The water is lower than it should be. By August, this is going to be really bad, and we're going to have hoot owl restrictions here. This isn't just a one-off season. So it isn't just all the trucks in the parking lot. Things are changing, and not always for the good.
John, what or who makes you connect so deeply to this? I mean, it's obvious. You live most of your life in another place, but you are tethered here. What is it?
Well, I don't think my personal experience is so unusual. And it's not unusual in my own family. My father did not live that many years in Montana full time. He was born in Iowa. They moved to Bozeman and eventually moved to Missoula. But he left to go to college, came back for a few years, and then left quasi-permanently. We would come back for every summer. He taught, so we had all summer here. We never lost the connection. So I'm kind of used to having a foot in two different camps. And I have found it very useful, to be honest. As a writer, when I come out here, I'm doing field work. I'm gathering stuff, I'm getting interviews, I'm transcribing interviews, maybe writing a few paragraphs, but I'm not sitting down and knocking off a 5,000 word chapter. I do that when I'm back in DC and I'm away from this. And my father understood that, and I think I learned it instinctively from him. Some people have to have two places to work. The intellectual life at the University of Chicago was very different from what it would have been for him out here. My life of the mind as a Washington correspondent for the Chicago Tribune and living in Washington for almost 50 years has been very different from what it would have been if I had lived out here. But I keep coming back because I am rooted in this place. And there's some financial reasons for this too. I mean, how many people want to live their lives in Montana, can't find something that will sustain themselves, a wife and 3 kids, leave the state, make their money, and then come back? And that's a very common pattern. So Montana as a sustainable, all your life kind of place works for some people. But it has not worked for my dad, and it hasn't worked for me. We found something else that works even better.
So I have to ask, we've had a lot of serious and wonderful history. Tell me the funny. There's got to be a good story. What's the funniest thing that's happened to you when you were fishing with your dad on the river with your brothers? Besides getting caught out with your first rod, tell me something else that was great that you have as a memory.
Jokes. I think you may stump me on that one. I'll give you one that happened right near here because it was heartwarming and rather than hilarious. Heartwarming to the extent that I was laughing and smiling and having a good time, and so was my Uncle Ken. As I said, we used to bring a whole crowd down here and spread out on the river, and the ethic was that you would go off and fish on your own, and then you would come back and tell stories about what had happened. And Ken didn't care about that ethic. He was a very companionable kind of guy. We all called him Uncle King, and he liked that. He was the king. So I was fishing farther down, and I wasn't doing very well, and I saw him on a hole, and he was just, doing okay, and I joined up with him. And he said, well, there's a fish that's working over there, John, and he said, I've been trying to catch him, and cast for him a couple of times. I said, why don't you try to cast for him? So I tried to cast for him. So we wound up, both of us, casting for the same fish who kept playing with us, and we started laughing. This isn't the only time it ever happened with me and Ken. This is a normal kind of evening or day or fishing experience with that guy. And it felt so wonderful and so different and full of warmth and goodwill. I suppose it was funny to the fish. I think the fish was enormously amused because we weren't really getting anywhere with him. And he knew that, but he wouldn't let it go. He'd just kind of keep coming up and let us know he was there.
That's perfect. Perfect.
You know, this reminded me, John, of there's a story in River, runs through it, that tells about going fishing on the Dearborn. And the whole crew from Wolf Creek piles in the back of Ken's truck, I believe it is, and they've got a mattress in the back end and they go fishing at Dearborn. And of course, we just came up this dusty, awful road, rutted and washed out to come to this picnic place. Maybe you could share a little bit with us about that Dearborn country that we're not going to get to visit today and the fishing experiences you've had up there.
Oh, the Dearborn was the back country when we were in Wolf Creek. I mean, Wolf Creek is the back country, but the Dearborn is where we went to have big family campouts and picnics. And it took about 35 miles of rutted out, bombed out road to get there. And if you passed somebody, anybody, on that trip going in or out, it was a real event. You know, who is that? Who's in that truck, you know? And it would probably be somebody you knew who had a ranch up there or whatever. It was very remote. The Burns family who lived in Wolf Creek knew the ranchers up there, and we'd get permission to go in. And it was basically virgin fishing and virgin territory. You would never think of seeing anybody else camping. As I said, you'd hardly see anybody else on the road. The fishing could be absolutely fabulous. And we'd have this big camp. We had an uncle who had been in the Air Force and actually had been at Pearl Harbor and actually got his squadron up into the air at gunpoint.
Wow.
But he would get these big military tents, and we'd set those up and they'd put out rows of mattresses for the kids, and we'd all haul in there. And that was a lot of fun. I've got a story about it in Home Waters, where one time we were all bedded down, we were on our way to sleep when all of a sudden the camp just started to fall apart and there's all this noise and thundering going on. And somebody came in and said, "You better come out here and see your father." And a whole herd of cattle was going through the camp and snorting, and they'd busted into the camp and it wasn't what they'd expected, and they were kind of piling all over each other. And then here came this cowboy right out of a Charlie Russell painting with the bandana and the hat pulled down and a leather scabbard on his saddle with a rifle in it, slapping against the side of the horse. Oh my God, you know, I've never seen anything like this. And he starts yelling at us, "What the hell are you doing here? You know, you're tearing my herd apart. It's private land." And my dad was there, and he was just standing there in a little Mackinac jacket that he had, a little windbreaker, tan, very modest. And he was talking to this guy. You know, the guy's on a horse, he's armed, he's running cattle. And my dad just told him that we were legitimate people, that we had permission to be here, that we had talked to the people who owned it, da-da-da-da. It turned out that his brother, the cowboy's brother, had given permission and never told the cowboy. So all of a sudden, you know, and got all the uncles behind my dad saying, "We're the Burnses, we're the Burns family from Wolf Creek. You know, we're not poachers or anything." And eventually the cowboy realized that he'd lost it. He'd lost the argument. And he'd lost his herd. He's all alone, everything's gone. And he's, from being this massive, impressive character, he turned into this little boy. Standing also, "Well," he said, "well, I've got to catch up to my cattle. I'm getting the hell out of here." And he turned around and rode off. And that's the kind of trip. That wasn't something that we did every time. But it happened once, and we had a lot of wonderful trips up in there.
John, you mentioned the Burns family from Wolf Creek, and of course they are your maternal grandparents. Maybe you could share with us a little bit about the Burnses and Wolf Creek and what role your grandfather Burns played and your grandmother in that town, and how it helped anchor you to this place as well. We talk a lot about the Macleans, But I found that Home Waters is full of stories about the Burns as
Yeah,
well.
it is, and that's one reason I wrote it, very purposefully, because I thought the Burns needed to be talked about. And my maternal grandparents, John Henry Burns and Florence McLeod, came to Wolf Creek after being in Phillipsburg and around Butte. I tried to trace back on John Henry Burns and find out about his entry into the United States the way I did with my paternal grandfather. And the record's very unclear. It's much more muddy. Family came over from Ireland, Northern Ireland, and settled in briefly in Massachusetts, traded a gravel pit they had there for one somewhere else that wasn't worth anything. And suddenly John Henry Burns and his siblings were cast loose on the world when they were very, very young to make their own way. John went up to Canada with a brother who drowned in a bad accident. He was, just a kid, and a sister came up and helped him, and they made their way down to Butte. And he turned out to be very charming and very entrepreneurial. He was not the outdoorsman that the rest of the family professes, not that kind of a type of person. So he wound up with a general store in Wolf Creek, Montana, that became a big community hub. It's a teeny tiny town with basically 2 streets and 2 big men, one on each street. John Henry had his general store on one street, and Frenchy Mounier had the other street with a motel and his stuff going on. Those were the 2 big guys. And in those days, everybody thought they were going to have a big strike, an ore strike, somewhere in the hills around Wolf Creek, because they'd had the big gold strike in Helena, in Last Chance Gulch. So the prospectors would come in, and they'd need a lot of stuff, and they didn't have any money. So he'd outfit them, and when you hit ore, come back and pay me off. And they didn't hit ore very often. But somehow he kept going, because all those ranches in the Dearborn country would send their sheep mainly, but also cattle, down through Wolf Creek to get to a railhead. And when they did that, they'd stock up for 3 months at John Henry Burns's general store at prices that were much higher than Helena, but do you want to go on 35 miles of road down to Helena that wasn't any good. Eventually it didn't work, because they put in a paved road to Helena. Things got easier, but even then, he still had enough people who kept their custom with him that it kept going till the end. Ken Burns stayed on in Wolf Creek, didn't try to run the store, had a ranch down in there, and even he eventually had to get out when they put in the internet. The interstate, not the internet. The internet came later. The interstate came in the 1960s, and the old Burns homestead is under the internet, the interstate. I'll get this right. And somebody asked me the other day, where do we find his home? Where can we go look at it? I said, well, just drive the interstate, and you'll be right over it. And I was kind of ashamed to see it all go, but it did. Anyway, he was a linchpin in the community. I mean, he made the thing work. He trusted people, didn't always pan out. Didn't bother him too much. Built a dance hall at one point in one of the big heydays of Wolf Creek, and 10 cents for a dance. People come from Great Falls. It got so popular. So he had himself a pretty good time.
So you've been in D.C., and we talked about this a little bit. You've been in D.C., you've been in other parts of the country, and you've been here. Where do you love to fish more?
Well, I love to fish more here still. There's good fishing in the east. I fish in the Blue Ridge, and I fish in Pennsylvania, which is very good, but it isn't home waters. Yeah. This is home waters. Right behind me, that's home waters.
We've got a backdrop of a newer version of Scotty Brown's bridge, and maybe John can tell us a little bit about the bridge, what it used to be, and what lies behind it.
Well, Scotty Brown was an early rancher in the Blackfoot Valley, and his ranch was up from here, across on the other side of the Blackfoot. and he had to get access to his ranch and had to drive his cattle. You can drive them in places you can drive them across the river, but the bridge is not bad either. So he built a bridge. He himself built it. And we used it for years, and it was, I won't say ramshackle, but you realized you were no longer on a solid road. At some point, the road authorities decided to build this lovely, modernistic, architecturally fine, but serviceable bridge. I mean, there's not much to it except it's hell for stout, and that's what you need here. Scotty's was the first rancher in Montana, according to him, to bring Black Angus to Montana. He was a Scotsman, and he brought him over by boat and by rail. And my dad used to work for him at roundup time. They'd round up his cattle and they'd drive them down to Potomac. They could get to the Potomac the first night, and then they'd drive them down to the railhead in Missoula the next night. And it was a big outing because you got to stay in the hotel in Potomac when you were a 15 or a 16-year-old kid working for Scotty Brown. I knew his daughter. She was a wonderful woman. She taught at Missoula High School for many, many years, and it was just a wonderful family. And now they call it Scotty Brown Bridge rather than Scotty Brown's Bridge, and it kind of gives it, the name has become part of the physical thing itself.
Beyond an image, if you could choose one primary source to tell the story of the river, what would it be? A map, a letter, newspaper article?
I think if I had to use one primary source, it would be a rod hookup, and it would be an old-fashioned rod, a heavy fiberglass rod with a Medalist Pfluger reel, number 8 line, which is a heavy line, and rigged up with one of George Kuenneberg's yellow quills, because that was the human contribution to the natural element.
So in doing that, that helps to connect to people. So when we talk about that, and you're talking about that rod, does that tell a story to students? Does it tell a story to your readers? What do you think it portrays?
Well, I think what I've found is that people want to know something solid about a story. They want on Lewis and Clark, they want to know right where Lewis and Clark stood and where they had lunch, and it's very hard to do that kind of thing. So the rod would give you a sense of, this is a rod used by one of the people in the book to catch the kind of fish we're talking about in the book. It would give them a sense of physical connection to a literary event. And I think that that is very important to people. It's important to me. I mean, I like having that because it brings things, for me, it brings things back. For somebody who hasn't got that kind of background, it makes them immediate.
John, we've got a busload full of kids backing up here, getting ready to get in the river. We don't know what school they're from, but they could be from any of our schools, okay? Tell me what you think makes this book accessible, more accessible, less acceptable, or pretty similar to River Runs Through It, and how is it accessible to these kids?
Well, what I found and been very pleased at is that my writing is accessible to young people. Home Waters is a different kind of writing, but my fire books have been read by 12-year-old girls, and they get it, some of them, not everyone. So that the writing is plain and straightforward. It's immediate kind of writing. It is tied into things that you can feel and touch, hopefully, through the writing. When I got interested in writing the first time, it was because it made me feel things that I was familiar with. I read Ernest Hemingway's Big Two-Hearted River, and that was it. I mean, yes, I know what he's talking about. I know exactly what he's talking about. I don't know the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I don't know these root beer colored rivers. He's taking me somewhere entirely different, but he's putting me there. You know, I'm there. I can feel it. And I like to think that my lifelong effort to write that kind of connective literature has worked.
as you built your stories, you did your research. What were the most valuable things that you found to use in your research?
Well, I found that I had been doing the research for 30 or 40 years or more. I had been collecting things. When my dad was getting older and couldn't give presentations or speeches when he got invitations, I was the one who did it. So I would write things, and I would try to answer the kind of questions that I get all the time, which is, what was it like to fish with Norman Maclean? And so I had a lot of that kind of stuff. I would give talks on my own. I gave a commencement address at University of Montana Western. And these things wound up being a huge scrapbook for me when I started writing Home Waters. In addition to that, I had a lot of documentary stuff. When I was doing the last tour in Chicago, working for the Chicago Tribune, I interviewed people who had known my Uncle Paul. I dug into the documentary evidence about his murder because I was interested in it. And I compiled this big bunch of stuff. And I wasn't sure that I would ever do anything with it. I didn't feel compelled to do anything with it. But when I started writing the book, it was all there. So I had everything from personal memories, some of them that I had rehearsed over and over again. The story of the first fish I ever caught with my dad. I tried to write that for 25 years and couldn't write it. And I would go back to the place where it happened and remember what it was, but I couldn't get it down on paper. There is a time to refrain from writing personal stories, and there's a time to do it. And when I sat down with Home Waters and was writing it, the book, and it came to the point where I should tell the story about my first fishing trip with my dad, it just flowed right out of me, because I'd done all that preliminary field work, remembering what the creosote in the bridge smelled like, what the willows looked like when they were hit by an outflow boundary before a hailstorm, the whole thing. I've been all the way through it. Other things were heavily documentary. The Lewis expedition through the Blackfoot Valley. I mean, I had to go to the Lewis journals on that. I had to go to a local expert here in Seeley Lake about that, a local historian. I had to go out and walk all the area. There's an area right back here from Scotty Brown's Bridge where there's a trail that was obviously used. And we spent half a day looking at that trail. There are places where it looks like the old Indian trail, where it's narrow and there are trees in it of great vintage. And there are other places where it looks like a wagon trail, so it's ambiguous. So there was field work, there was book work, there was interviewing work, there was memory work, there was a whole colossal lot of things. I looked at one paragraph in Home Waters and identified sentences in that that were based on 4 different decades of investigation and research.
Wonderful. So we're lucky. Hi, you guys. Hi. I'm a middle school teacher. Welcome. What are you guys here for?
Rafting.
You're rafting?
Yeah.
Well, we're here with a very special person. This is Mr. Maclean. Can you say hi to Mr. Maclean behind us?
Hi, gang. How are you?
Mr. Maclean
Nice
is
to
an
see you
author.
guys.
You guys have to read books in school?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Maclean just wrote an amazing book called Home Waters, and it's just been published. Okay? And Mr. Maclean, can you tell these guys what you used to do for your other part of your job besides being an author?
Well, I used to be a newspaper man, and then I used to write books about fatal wildland fires. I wrote 5 of those.
Nice. So he's got lots of books, and he used to write for a newspaper. Pretty cool, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty neat. Well, he just had his book out. Have you guys ever heard of the story A River Runs Through It?
Yeah.
That's his dad.
Oh, wow.
Pretty cool, huh?
Now, he
Very
can
cool.
tell
He
you
could tell you
about this river because he was here at your age and even younger,
That's what I was-
and he's come every year. He lives in Washington, D.C., in the Georgetown area, but he has a place up at Seeley, and he, like you, loves the river. So, John, you want to tell him some things that you think are important for them to know to take care of this place?
Well, I think first of all, you got to have a good time. Don't get sunburned. If you fall in the river, don't worry about it. You've got jackets on, you've got adult supervision. It might even cool you off a little bit, and I would bet that by the end of the day, you're all in the river. But as you're going down there, think about how important it would be for your children to have that kind of an experience a long time from now, and what it would take to hold this, to keep this for them. because trust me, it's worth doing.
So a lot of you guys have water bottles with you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have a water bottle like I have? You have a Hydro Flask. I see some around, other Gatorade. Okay, big ones. So you want to make sure they stay in the boat. If they come out of the boat, where do you want to put them? Back in the boat, right?
Yeah.
We take our trash in and out with us, leave no trace.
Yeah, I don't want to litter.
That's a huge piece, right? So I got a question for you. How many of you guys live right around here? How many of you guys live Missoula? Okay, how many of you guys live at 20 miles from Missoula, close to Missoula, but not in Missoula? Okay, all right. Have you guys been on the river before?
Yep.
Yeah, how many first time on the river? Couple. Good. Rock star. You guys have a beautiful, clear day. Mr. Maclean was looking for fish earlier, and we were looking for that. So when I tell you, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to pick on a couple. See, you got a teacher. What happens? You got wrong thing. You got two teachers standing here. So now I got a question for you. If I was to ask you in one word, think about this, in one word, if I said, what does the river mean to you? In one word, what would you say?
Water.
Okay, hold on. Just think really quick. So if I was to say, so I'll start, I'll give an example. Water's a good one, but let's think beyond this, let's think a little bit beyond that. So the river means, so if I was to say, what does the river mean to you? I would say legacy. Somebody else give me a volunteering answer. Go for it.
Landmark.
Landmark.
Fun.
Fun.
Harder for that.
Same thing?
Yeah.
Yep. What else? Who's got something different? Yes.
Memories.
Memories. Yep.
Beauty.
Beauty.
Time.
Time. Good. Boy, you guys would be getting good grades in my class. Yep.
Life.
Life. Wow. Yes, sir.
Creation.
Creation.
Excitement.
Excitement. Good. What else?
Living.
Living. What about you, Mr. Maclean?
Well, I can't top those. I think the guys who've got legacy and memory and creation and fun, you know, I think you got the idea. Get on the river and go have a good time.
Thank you all. I'm from. Tell us where you're from.
Thank you.
Where are you guys from? Oh, wait.
Got from Sealy Lake.
Sealy Lake.
Yeah, I go to Sealy Swan High School in time.
Potomac.
Yeah.
What is it, a school?
Glad to have you here, guys.
Liberty Lake, Washington. Wow. It's Potomac.
Yep. Or just up the road.
Spokane, Washington. Okay. So all over Sealy, Spokane,
Great.
Montana. Hey, you guys. You had a special experience today, and I hope you have lots of special experiences on the river. Be safe and enjoy it, and take care of it so that we can all come back.
Yeah.
Okay? All right, are you going to take your rafts down?
Yeah.
All right, we have a couple more questions for Mr. Maclean. Hey, big high five for Mr. Maclean, right? Yeah, he's got it. Isn't that pretty cool? He's got a book out. You guys met a real live author.
Yeah.
So somebody's
My mom's
Home
an
Waters.
author.
Home Waters. So you're going to have to find that book. It just came out. It's in hardback.
giving free books out? Autograph?
No,
He's got a Sharpie. He can autograph your head.
John.
John?
Yeah, what's your first name?
Hey guys,
Eli
let's leave them
Cassidy.
alone.
Eli.
We're gonna get
Eli.
to the rafts right now, guys.
Nice to meet you guys.
Right on over here.
Let's go.
So John, I gotta remember that.
How are
Thank
you?
you so much. That was super cool.
Yeah,
You're from Montana?
Yeah, Dutton.
Dutton?
I'm gonna ask my mom. She knows you.
I'm gonna
Already?
read your book.
Good. It's really great that you guys showed up. That's
Yeah.
Perfect
That
time.
was a new
a little
experience.
different.
Yeah.
Come here.
Okay.
So, Mr. Maclean, look at here's a Sealy Lake.
You're my Sealy Lake guy.
Yeah.
Where you live in the Sealy?
His last name is Seeley.
You know where Pops is?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right there. Yeah.
Isn't that pretty cool?
He said his last name is Sealy.
Oh, no, his last name is Sealy.
But nice that you all have a connection at Pops, huh?
Well, give my best to your parents.
Good for you, buddy. Nice to see you. And now you have a connection with an author. Isn't that pretty cool?
Yeah.
All right, you can go home and say, hey, I met this guy, Mr. Maclean.
Yeah. You guys have a great time on the river. Wish we were going.
I know. Hey, you gotta navigate your Y'all have fun. Stay out of trouble.
You know that's practice.
Oh, I know.
You guys have a nice day.
Hey, thank you. Y'all have a good one.
Go make memories.
Have a good time, y'all.
Bye-bye.
guys got the Joker for your lead.
No one got it.
Y'all have a good one.
It's the tablet for a reason.
Have fun, you guys.
Oh, that's precious.
Let's go back to your research for a second. You talked about your notebook, and you talked about your collection of papers. What was one of the most surprising things you found in your research?
Well, one of the most surprising things was when I went back to do the story of Wolf Creek and the Burnses. I'd gotten a call from one of my cousins who said, John, and we were just talking, she said, John, there's so much written about the Macleans. How about something about the Burnses? I said, we really ought to do a history of the Burnses. I started writing Home Waters and digging around and stuff and found out I'd done it and forgotten about it. When Ken Burns, my uncle, was still alive, he'd lost his wife, he'd lost Dottie, and he was kind of sad. And he had tried to write a history of the family, and we got talking about it, and he said, I'll give you what I've written. It was a half of a notebook page. I said, why don't we do a real one? So we sat down and we did a 14, 15-page history of the Burns family, and I showed it to my dad, and he made a few corrections in it, and there it was. And I'd forgotten all about it. So it was a surprise to find it, and that I was so dumb that I had forgotten that I had it, and had just kind of blown past it. And a lot of that wound up being the history of Wolf Creek in Home Waters.
It speaks to making sure that you're documenting those histories or asking about those stories, right?
It also makes sure that you know what you're doing. And I think if I had my education to redo, I would take a couple of courses in historical archiving so that you knew how to organize this stuff and keep it. I was doing another research project the other day about Man Gulch. I thought, boy, my books on Man Gulch are all back in DC, and I've got to catch up on this thing because I've got to do an interview. And I started looking through my computer, and it was all there in different parts, but it wasn't well organized. And I think my failure as a researcher is that I haven't been as organized as I should have been. And that's something I would really change if I could go back to when I was 17 or 18 years old and just starting to take serious courses.
John, you and I talked a lot about this book as it progressed, and I was kind of in the background and watching you create it. And one of the things you shot for that I'd love to talk a little bit about before we quit are the end papers and, of course, the illustrations.
Oh, I'm very happy with the illustrations in Home Waters, but they took an awful lot of work. I did not set out to write a companion book to A River Runs Through It. I set out to do something very different and started out as a fish story. But as we progressed, I could see that there were parallels. And one of the parallels that I leaped at and wanted was the wood engravings in the first edition of A River Runs Through It. There's a cover engraving of a bluff with a river below it, and then each chapter has a little wood engraving. They're absolutely beautiful. My dad worked on those. I thought that he had gotten photographs out here in Montana and taken them back, and they basically traced them. Again, before I even started Home Waters, a guy was doing an essay on the illustrations in A River Runs Through It, and got a hold of me and said, I'm trying to find the guy who did those original ones in A River Runs Through It, and I'm having trouble. Can you help me? I said, yeah. So we found him together in retirement, and he explained a lot of things that had gone on. They're not tracings. They are original drawings based on photographs and other images that my dad brought him. The cover one is not of the Blackfoot or of Montana. It's an imaginative recreation. Fine. So I said to my editor, why don't we do this? Why don't we have wood engravings for each of the chapters? It's not a small undertaking. So he went to his bosses and they said, all right, we'll do it. So we found, my editor found, Wesley Bates, who did these wood engravings. And I thought, we're on a roll here. Said, what we also need, is a map as an end paper. End paper sounds like it's at the end of the book. It's not, it's at the beginning. In this case, it's also at the end. When you open up the front, there it is. Open up the back, there it is again. I said, we need a map that has a little old-fashioned feel to it, but it isn't some funky thing. And I want all the places that are important in the book to be in that map. And so we found a guy who can do that, and he did a beautiful job of it. So I'm really on a roll here. There are different ways to put photographs in books. The cheapest way is what they call scatter art, and it's black and white, and you scatter it through the book. The next way is to have an 8-page folio of black and white. The Shoot the Moon is a 16-page color portfolio, and that's what we wound up with. So it is extremely heavily illustrated. People seem to like that. I know I like it a lot. And there is a direct link to A River Runs Through It with those wood engravings. We were sitting around at the end saying, well, what should we call this thing? You know, because you've got to have a name for it. It can't be just from Missoula to Wolf Creek, Montana. And we talked about it for 20 minutes or half an hour. I said, fine, why don't we call it Home Waters? And so that's what we called it. And that's what it is.
So you've talked about the end papers and the inset. I have a question. On the cover design, there's a fly.
Right.
Did you choose that? Is it just an innocuous one? What is it?
No, it's not innocuous at all. And that was a stroke of creativity by the editor, Peter Hubbard. Wesley Bates was doing these wood engravings. And that is the image of the fly that is on the cover twice and is repeated throughout the book, is an image of George Kroonenberg's quill flies. And it wasn't my idea, it was Peter's, and it's terrific. I've had little icons like that in other books, fire boots or one thing or another, but this one really fits in. The cover image, I didn't mention the cover of the book, and should have, as part of the illustration package. That is a photograph taken by a guy named Alec Underwood, who works for the Montana Wildlife Federation, and he's a very fine photographer. He and I got together, had shared interests. I said, why don't we go fishing together sometime? We came here, right here, to Scotty Brown's Bridge, and spent an evening going downstream and fishing. There are a couple of interior photographs in Home Waters of that evening. And as we were going back, we were talking about photography. He's very good at it, and I like it. And he said, you know, you got to see one photograph that I took that I think is the best one I've ever taken of the Blackfoot. And I looked at it, and I said, that's it. And I showed it to my editor. He said, that's it. That's the mood of Home Waters. And that became the cover. And more than the cover, it wraps around to the back so that you get the whole thing. I made the mistake at one point of asking Alex, where was that taken? And he told me, and I can't forget it, but I'm not passing it on, because it's such a fuzzed, imaginative, spiritual kind of picture that it shouldn't have an objective correlative, except the Blackfoot.
So you've connected the past to your book now. Has this sparked any interest or any thoughts about something in the future? Have you thought about another idea in all of your research and the stories that brings you back home to Montana that would be a next step for a book?
I'm working on another book, but it's another fire book. I've been working on it for 8 years with a partner, and we've taken hiatuses. We're currently in a hiatus. I can't do anything except the Home Waters at the present time. I'd like to finish it, but it's very, very difficult and very problematic. I don't know if we're going to get there. As far as another big project, if I can get that fire book done, then I'll think about another big project. It ain't over till it's over.
John, I would like to end this beautiful day with just your voice and some of your thoughts about what you hope to accomplish with Home Waters and what you see so far, the impact of it. You know, maybe personally, but as well with the people that you've met so far, and just end in your work.
Well, the book didn't end when it ended. I think that what I have discovered with this is a lot of new stuff since I finished the book. The first thing I discovered was the reaction to it, which has been very positive. But I'm speaking here of my reaction to getting that kind of feedback. I've written 5 books about fatal wildland fires. You do not get up in front of an audience and laugh and smile when you talk about things like that. And when I get up in front of an audience now to talk about Home Waters, I laugh and I smile. And it's a totally different feeling, and I've had to evolve into it. I didn't really trust it to begin with. And then memories have come back that the book has stirred in me since it came out. And I've tried to do kind of what my father was doing with The River Runs Through It. He tried to settle his relationship with his brother Paul. I didn't set out to do that. But Paul has been a shadow person in my life from the time I was very small to the present day. And I learned a lot from that guy. Like him, I became a newspaper man. Like him, I fish. But I also learned a lot of negative lessons from him. If you behave this way, it's going to end badly. Don't do it. I mean, he didn't have to say that. He just lived that example. And I kind of lost him for a long time and gone away from him. And now I've come back and had to think an awful lot about him. And I deal with his death in the book. But I've also dealt in my own mind and a little bit in the book with his true legacy, which to me is really important. After A River Runs Through It came out, my dad got a lot of fan mail. And some of it was from people who said, I, like you, had a sibling, a brother or a sister, who was troubled, and I tried to help. I tried to give some of myself, and it was refused, and I felt alone and lost. I've read your book, and suddenly I understand that there is understanding and compassion for me, that I belong to a large group of people, that there are lots of us who are like this, and I feel relief. So that's a wonderful kind of a legacy to leave. Secondly, there would be no A River Runs Through It without Paul's murder. There would be no Home Waters without Paul's murder. There would be no 5 books on fire by me. There would be no Young Men in Fire. I would not have had him as a negative as well as a positive example, and I might have gotten into a lot of trouble, and I didn't. That's an extraordinary legacy here, how many years after, decades and decades after, what could have been a life that ended without meaning in a back alley in Chicago has become an illumination for a lot of people, including me. And that has come mostly after Home Waters was finished, for me, the realization of it.